What can we learn about leadership from the clash between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson? Welcome to Leadership and Legacy, Conversations at the George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon. I'm Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, Director of the library. In this podcast series, we talk with experts about leadership and history, how studying these stories helps us understand our current moment, and how we can apply lessons from leaders in the past to our own lives. Jeffrey Rosen is the CEO Emeritus of the National Constitution Center, a professor of law at the George Washington University, and a contributing editor at The Atlantic. If that wasn't enough, he's also a prolific writer. He is the author of multiple best-selling books, a former legal affairs editor for The New Republic, and a former staff writer at The New Yorker. At Mount Vernon, we've been lucky enough to host him for talks on his two most recent books, The Pursuit of Happiness, How Classical Writers on Virtue Inspired the Lives of the Founders and Defined America, and The Pursuit of Liberty, How Hamilton versus Jefferson Ignited the Lasting Battle over Power in America. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for joining us. This is so exciting to have another chance to talk to you about your book. And I say another because we had the privilege of hosting a book event for your new book at Mount Vernon a couple of weeks ago, and the audience enjoyed it so thoroughly. And so I'm excited to kind of dig in from the angle of leadership in particular, because the people you talk about and the people who are inspired by these ideas are some of the leaders that we, associate with the greats in American history. But perhaps as a place to start, just to set the table for us, you have been talking about for the last couple of years some big concepts, happiness and liberty, and I know union is coming next. So how did you begin this project, and why were these ideas that you felt were essential to tackle?
It was a series of synchronicities that led me to each of the topics. For happiness, I was struck by the fact that both Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson had chosen as their definition of happiness a book by Cicero that I'd never heard of called the Tusculan Disputations. Cicero defines happiness not as feeling good, but being good, not the pursuit of immediate pleasure, but the pursuit of long-term virtue. Then I came across a reading list that Jefferson had, and in the section of moral philosophy, Cicero headed the list, and then a series of other classical and Enlightenment moral philosophers. So basically, the project was just a reading project to read the books on Jefferson's list because I'd never read them and thought it was a gap in my education. And I spent a year reading all that wonderful wisdom, and it changed the way I thought about happiness and how to be a good person, a good citizen, and I decided to write a book, The Pursuit of Happiness, to capture what I learned. The second book, The Pursuit of Liberty, was also inspired by a phrase, a book I came across and had long been struck by, Herbert Croly's Promise of the American Life, which called on Theodore Roosevelt to deploy Hamiltonian means for Jeffersonian ends, that is, the Hamiltonian means of strong federal power to the Jeffersonian ends of curbing the banks and big corporations and promoting democracy. I then wondered whether any other historian had traced this battle between Hamilton and Jefferson throughout American history. I knew about the battle. I'd studied it in high school, I guess, in law school, and it's the most familiar antithesis in American history is the idea that Hamilton's vision of national power was pitted against Jefferson's vision of local democracy. So I thought it'd be interesting to tell that story, but I wondered if anyone had traced it all the way through, from the founding era all the way up to the present day. And to my surprise, no one had. There are great books on the separate influence of Hamilton and Jefferson over time, but no one had brought it all together. So I just thought it'd be a really interesting way of learning about all of American history, and that's what I did.
I think you're probably I don't want to say the only person, but certainly I think college professors, especially classics professors, would have been thrilled to have you in their classroom because they probably make students read these books with a lot of complaining, and you did so willingly.
Well, it sounds weird, of course, and I didn't do this sort of deep, geeky reading, really ever, because even in high school and college and law school, when I was a reader, I was reading for my classes and not for its own sake. And I'd fallen out of the habit of reading for its own sake because I'm addicted to screens and I'm blogging, and I don't blog, but I'm checking blogs, email, and social media and not reading books. So the big takeaway from this project for me, the first one, was getting me back into the habit of deep reading. As we shared when we talked last, I have this new rule or habit that when I wake up, I'm not allowed to browse or surf until I read books. It's totally been transformative. It's what allowed me to write the Hamilton Jefferson book. And I shared it at Mount Vernon, and there and everywhere, folks respond to it because we're all addicted to screens, and many of us have fallen out of the habit of daily reading. And I can just, like a recovering addict, confess to how good it feels to have developed this alternative habit, and lots of folks are responding, and I'm just so gratified by the hunger across America for deep reading.
Well, it's usually at the end, we kind of talk about what are some leadership lessons that you can apply to your daily life, but we're going to start with that. I mean, that's such a great lesson, and I think you're so right that we find ourselves, sometimes I'll look up and I literally have 3 screens in front of me. I have a phone, I have a computer, and I have a television. And I'm like, this is utterly preposterous. The human brain is not meant to work this way, and I'm not doing any of these 3 things well. And so I think that is all something we can apply to our life. Okay, so you mentioned this Hamilton-Jefferson fight. And this is, of course, a fight they had in real life. They had it through the newspapers or through their supporters through the newspapers. They had it in Washington's cabinet. They had it in their attempts to shape legacies. And of course, their legacies have continued to fight. So could you lay out their 2 world visions for us to set the table for how that has shaped American history since then?
Absolutely. Hamilton favors national power. Jefferson states' rights. Hamilton favors rule by elites. Jefferson favors democracy and the will of the majority.
Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson were the most iconic political enemies of the early republic. But Rosen's argument goes a step further, suggesting that the political priorities each man represented can be traced all the way through American history.
Hamilton favors strong executive power. Jefferson imagines constrained but vigorous congressional power. And Hamilton favors liberal construction of the Constitution and Jefferson's strict construction. Those 4 axes are the main ones throughout American political, intellectual, economic, and social history.
One of the things that I love that you write in this book is that you describe them as the gold and silver threads of American history. And you argue that the tension between the 2 is actually really valuable and really important. And I would love for you to explain that, explain what you mean by these threads, explain what you mean by the tension. And maybe as a way of doing so, there are really positive leadership attributes in both visions that I would love for us to explore.
Would love to do that, and it will be great to explore them with you. The phrase golden and silver threads came to mind because they're woven throughout the tapestry of American history. And sometimes they're side by side, and sometimes they cross, and sometimes they pull so far apart that they threaten to snap. But it is the productive tension on both ends of the thread that sustains the core of the American idea. And it's on the rare occasions when the threads are pulled too far in one direction or the other that both sides tumble over and the shooting begins. It's the productive tension on both ends of the threads that prevents us from descending into violence. So the first leadership lesson is that tension can be good. It can be necessary. I guess by tension, I mean a productive conversation or dialogue or debate. Debate is not a bug in the system, but a feature. It's a necessary feature. And it goes back to the way that the founders in the Enlightenment think that truth is developed. Madison says, and Jefferson as well, truth has nothing to fear from error as long as reason is free to combat it. The idea is that truth is produced in the homes, would call it the marketplace of ideas, and Madison calls it the commerce of ideas, where you have to hear evidence from people of different perspectives in order to make up your own mind about religious, political, or factual truths. That's really a Jeffersonian insight. It's Madison and Jefferson, both in their Virginia bills on religious freedom, and then ultimately in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, supported by Hamilton, that Madison and Jefferson set out this vision of government by discussion and truth being produced through dialogue and debate. So that's the central principle of the liberal idea. It's the central principle of the American idea, that a truth is not produced by a divine right of kings or by popes or priests or ministers of any kind. By fiat, it's produced by individuals making up their own mind. To make up their own mind, they have to hear many sides, and by hearing many sides, they can converge on the common good.
Do you think that this principle that you have to hear multiple perspectives, and that often produces a compromise in which neither side fully gets what they want? You know, Washington certainly embodied that and embraced that in his cabinet, in fact, created an administration with that concept in mind as a central feature, in that if he had a difficult decision, he wanted to have Jefferson and Hamilton, and at times even pleaded with Jefferson to not retire because he wanted to have both perspectives And I don't think he did so because he was necessarily, he of course had political treatises. He was reading some of the Enlightenment thinkers, but I'm not sure he was doing that because of the Enlightenment thinkers. I wonder if that was just how he, instinctually, he felt that he was doing it. Do you have a sense of where that impulse came from?
You're so right that Washington is the model for principled leadership that encourages government by discussion. And the vision of him asking Hamilton and Jefferson for separate memos on the central constitutional question of the day, the constitutionality of the national bank, and then deliberating and favoring Hamilton, is Washington at his most judicious. And Jefferson recognized Washington's temperance and deliberation as the central virtue of his virtuous character. I think it was characterological with him. There are all sorts of reads on where his aversion to open conflict and his constant efforts to master his own temper and avoid losing control came from. Ron Chernow thinks it may have come from his mom, who was nagging him all the time and he was trying to control his temper. It may have been other factors, but it's characterological with him and it defines his leadership.
Well, he is certainly not the only one who has embodied this. And I think it is no surprise that the presidents that typically rank towards the top on the C-SPAN rankings, the ones that are revered, are the ones that were not afraid to surround themselves with people who said no or who said you're wrong. And many of them often pull from different elements of Jefferson and Hamilton. This is certainly true of Lincoln. This is true of FDR. This is true of Reagan. So I asked you to do this at our event, and it's so helpful. So could you walk us through, and I think I referred to it as the double-stranded helix of the DNA, of where Hamilton and Jefferson, how their fortunes go up and down over time, and how they were used by some of these great leaders?
Well, it's so much fun to trace the threads throughout American history because they're constantly going up and down, and parties are switching from one to the other or combining them to achieve particular political goals, but they're the through line. So broadly, Hamilton dies in the duel, and Jefferson is ascendant. The old Federalist Party is dead, and Hamilton has no jutes, no constituents. And in the era of good feeling and even the antebellum era, everyone's a Jeffersonian, from Henry Clay, who founds the Whig Party on the principles of Hamilton, quoting Hamilton's American system as the foundation for his vision of broad federal power to create internal improvements, and yet invokes Jefferson as his hero, as it happens both studied with the same law tutor, George Wythe. And then we have Lincoln, who said all honor to Jefferson, and talked about how the two parties, like drunken men changing coats, had exchanged their allegiance, and now Republicans were the party of Jefferson. And the Jefferson that he invoked was the Jefferson of the Declaration of Independence. And he stands in front of Independence Hall in 1861 and says he'd never had a thought politically that didn't stem from the Declaration. And then the war came, as Lincoln said. And after the war, Jefferson is sent back from the White House in disgrace. Grant takes a statute that President Polk had moved to the White House of Jefferson. He doesn't want to look on the prophet of secession, and he sends him back to the Capitol basement, where a statue of Hamilton has just been put up in the rotunda. And James Garfield leads a Hamilton revival, making Hamilton the patron saint of Reconstruction and broad federal power to enforce civil rights. John Bingham puts Hamilton and Marshall at the center of the Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution. The only dissenter from the Supreme Court decision striking down Reconstruction is John Marshall Harlan, who reveres John Marshall and his own hero and mentor Hamilton. And Harlan is the head of the Alexander Hamilton Memorial Society. And then we have the amazing election of 1912, where Theodore Roosevelt says, I'm a Hamiltonian when it comes to federal power and a Jeffersonian when it comes to democracy. Woodrow Wilson embraces Hamilton as the inspiration for consolidated congressional government with a strong president and Congress along the British model. And old William Howard Taft, traditional defender of judicial review, likes Hamilton and Marshall for judicial independence. Then Franklin Roosevelt reads a book by Claude Bowers, a journalist, saying Jefferson and Hamilton, the battle for democracy over aristocracy. He invites Bowers to speak at the Democratic Convention in 1928. And once FDR wins, he reinvents the New Deal as the child of none other than Thomas Jefferson. And this takes chutzpah for FDR because he's just exploding the size of the federal government, but invoking the patron saint of limited government. He does this by emphasizing the Jefferson of democracy rather than libertarianism, and puts Jefferson on the nickel and builds the Washington Memorial and dies on Jefferson's birthday with an undelivered speech about Jefferson on his desk at Warm Springs. Then Ronald Reagan says that he left the Democratic Party in 1960 because it had abandoned the principles of Jefferson and limited government, and he reinvents the Republicans of the 80s as libertarian rather than majoritarian Jefferson. And now we come to today, where Hamilton's fate, he's languishing, he's forgotten, he's unloved and unfriended and alone, and all of a sudden, boom, Ron Chernow in the musical just send him into the stratosphere, and he's transformed into the rapping champion of the American dream and a scrappy immigrant. And President Obama debuts the musical at a White House poetry jam and then quotes Hamilton in his Cooper Union address as the patron saint of healthcare reform. Who would have thought that he would have had such an incredible apotheosis as a rap star? And now we come to today, and the legacy of both founders is contested. Hamilton is still hot, of course, because of the musical, and Jefferson's generally reviled by progressives as the enslaving hypocrite of Monticello, and then some want to break up with the founders entirely, whereas President Trump said that he fought the election of 1920 to prevent Democrats from tearing down statues of Thomas Jefferson in Charlottesville. So I think that shows us that we settle in a place where the debate continues.
Absolutely. And I suspect it will continue for some time. What I think is so fascinating about this thread is that it overlaps with the political party changes that we have seen. It overlaps, of course, with cultural changes. It overlaps with political changes. But it also is reflected in battles over the Constitution and the Supreme Court. And that is an area of leadership that we have tried to explore over the last year, in recognition that there are three branches of government. Ideally, we are served best when all three have good and strong leadership and are not deferring to the other. So could you explore for us how some of these ideas come through in the constitutional battles over the course of American history?
Well, they're really central to the battle over the Bank of the United States, which goes on to be the defining constitutional battle for the rest of American history. Remember, Chief Justice Marshall has by his side Hamilton's memo over the bank to Washington, because he has Washington's papers. He's writing Washington's biography. And Washington's nephew, Bushrod, has given Marshall the Washington papers, and Marshall reads Hamilton's memos with his liberal construction of the necessary and proper clause. He said the word necessary should be interpreted to mean conducive or appropriate or useful rather than absolutely or indispensably necessary, as Jefferson insisted. And Marshall sides with Hamilton. He writes his views into the U.S. reports. And that battle between liberal and strict construction of the necessary and proper clause, or the territory clause, in the case of the Dred Scott decision, becomes the central one. On Dred Scott, the question is whether to adopt a Jeffersonian or Hamiltonian construction of the territories clause. There are several flip-flops here, because Jefferson himself changed his views on the question of whether or not Congress could ban slavery in the territories, first supporting it and coming to oppose it. And Tawney sides with the later, not earlier Jefferson, and that leads to the Dred Scott decision. And then after the Civil War, think of the really big constitutional conflicts. There's the constitutionality of Reconstruction legislation. And once again, it's liberal versus strict construction when it comes to whether or not the Civil Rights Act of 1875 is constitutional, and the Supreme Court 8-1 strikes it down, embracing Jeffersonian strict construction, with only the Hamiltonian John Marshall Harlan dissenting. In the 20th century, the central battle is over the constitutionality of the New Deal. And we're back to liberal and strict construction of the necessary and proper clause. And the New Deal court initially sides with Jefferson and strikes down the first New Deal, and then switches and sides with Hamilton and upholds the second New Deal, which is less centralizing and consolidating. And then President Ronald Reagan resolves to appoint originalist justices to the court who will construe the Constitution in light of its original understanding, he originally says, although he then revises this to original public meaning. But in fact, the central debate on the Rehnquist and then the Roberts Court is not between originalism and non-originalism. It's between liberal and strict construction of the Constitution. And on this question, originalist justices divide, with the more Hamiltonian Justice Antonin Scalia taking a broad view of Congress's power to regulate medical marijuana, for example, or to defer to regulatory agencies, and Justice Clarence Thomas taking a more Jeffersonian view and wanting to strike down much of the post-New Deal administrative state as exceeding Congress's power under the necessary and proper clause, as well as overturning the decision that led to deference to administrative agencies.
It's amazing that we've been debating these subjects for over 200 years, and I think we're farther apart on an agreement than we have ever been, which speaks to the power and the lasting nature, I think, of their visions, but also the concept that there have really been two different visions for America from the very beginning. And I often tell people that that's okay, that if anything, the founding legacy is a very messy one, and so it should be comforting to us that we are perhaps still in a messy place, because if they couldn't come to an agreement, perhaps it's not a surprise that we can't.
Well, it's so true that we have been deeply polarized before as we are now. And in the sense of agreement on political leaders, we've never been further apart, not since the Civil War, the end, have we been this polarized. But it's a negative polarization that is more determined to destroy the other side than to debate the other side. And in that sense, I don't know that we're further apart than ever on principles, although we are on partisanship. In fact, as the Supreme Court shows, you can be a Hamiltonian or Jeffersonian originalist, and conservatives can respectfully agree or disagree about whether to be a liberal or a strict constructionist. Similarly, there are libertarians, which is a Jeffersonian quality, in both the Democratic and Republican parties. It's the fact that we're more determined to defend our party above all, and we won't debate principles, instead being focused on personalities, that leads to the fact that we're further apart. If we could just recognize the fact that both parties contain people who might plausibly consider themselves Hamiltonian or Jefferson, or any combination of the two, because the threads are so malleable, then we realize that we may have more in common than we think. But in any event, we got to get back to that productive tension and stop being more interested in destroying the other side than in debating them.
It's such a good point. All of the studies today show that if you actually ask people where they are in terms of their values and the things they believe in, that we actually have far more agreement than we think we do. It's more of a reflection of either the political discourse or how people want us to feel. And in some ways, that is also a Washington position, because in his letters, or when they met in person, Hamilton and Jefferson were constantly complaining to him about the other, about how they started it, or they did this, or they did this. And he would urge them to see each other as patriots, that maybe they disagreed about the method for doing something, but that they were both ultimately committed to the same thing, which was a stronger future for the United States. They did not see it that way. And you draw this disagreement to a dinner, maybe not the dinner that most people think of, which is the one that's featured in Alexander Hamilton the musical, but a different one. And while I think that perhaps they were always sort of predestined to not get along because they were so different in every way that one could be different, including how they presented as men, their visions of masculinity were different. This dinner did not help things. So can you tell us about the Julius Caesar dinner?
What a dinner it was. Washington is away, which is always dangerous, I suppose, and the cabinet gathers while the president's on a southern tour. Not a great idea, especially over some Madeira at Jefferson's house. And at some point in the evening, Hamilton says, "Who are those three guys on the wall?" And Jefferson replies, "These are my three visions of the greatest men in history: John Locke, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton." And Hamilton pauses and blurts out, "The greatest man that ever lived was Julius Caesar." And Jefferson then goes on to found the Democratic Republican Party in opposition to the supposed Caesarism and monarchical ambitions of Hamilton. There are a bunch of things that raise some eyebrows about the story. And the first, of course, is the question of whether it actually happened the way Jefferson recorded it. He's writing in his annus, or his diary, decades later, and is it really possible that Hamilton didn't know who those three guys on the wall were? Jefferson may have been reconstructing it for his own benefit. But what he undoubtedly...
His annus also has a lot of details that I'm pretty convinced he wrote when he felt like writing, and were not necessarily accurate reflections of what happened at the moment.
And the story is too good to be true. Because the second part of the story is that later in the evening, John Adams supposedly says, "Purge the British Constitution of its corruption, and it would be perfect." And Hamilton supposedly responds, "Purge it of its corruption. It would lose its perfection. As it is the corruption that makes it the most perfect constitution ever." Hamilton's using corruption in the sense that David Hume used it, as a way for the executive to get influence over the legislature by giving them appointments, not financial corruption. But it's also neat that one wonders, in any event, it was good enough for the best opposition party slogan in history, because Jefferson founds the Democratic Republican Party in opposition to what he calls the monocrats, or the Caesaristic ambitions of Hamilton and the Federalists. Hamilton, as Ron Chernow speculates, was almost certainly joking if he did say a version of that, because He also fears a Caesar-like demagogue who will subvert the republic from below by flattering the people and to exchange their liberties for cheap luxuries. Hamilton fears democracy, and he fears a Caesar who will rise from the people and then consolidate power in his own hands. He wants a life term to the president to obviate the danger of the populist demagogue who won't be tempted to flatter the people for cheap popularity. Jefferson also fears a Caesar, in fact, but from above rather than below, who will cross the Rubicon, persuade the Senate to abandon its prerogatives and consolidate power and call off democratic elections. And he worries that a future president will lose an election by a few votes and refuse to leave office, as Jefferson writes to Madison. His solution is a one-year term limit for the president, so he can't be tempted to run again. And that basic debate over the nature and scope of executive power defines American history.
I want to get back into their various fears for a moment, but I think I'm on this in agreement with Turner, which is that Hamilton did have a sense of humor and did sometimes like to be intentionally histrionic to make a point. I think there's a pattern of him doing that. I also think for all of his excellent qualities, I'm not sure Jefferson did have much of a sense of humor. And I think he probably would have missed that Hamilton was yanking his chain.
Wow, that's so interesting, and that seems convincing. And in any event, Jefferson certainly was a master at taking his opponent's statements to political advantage, as the Jeffersonians were. And Hamilton must have made himself vulnerable to this sort of thing by his extravagant statements. The other most notorious thing Hamilton ever said, supposedly, is, "Your people, sir, is a great beast." But as Stephen Mott shows in his great book on the Hamilton image over time, this was recorded by Henry Adams, who didn't like Hamilton, as the whole Adams family didn't. And it was a kind of third-hand source. There was no reliable source for a dinner at which Hamilton supposedly exclaimed this. Of course, it was also at a dinner where Hamilton said the stuff that led to the duel. You don't want to be with Hamilton at a dinner party. That's a dangerous thing.
We also don't know how much consumption of alcoholic beverages were happening in these places, too. Absolutely. So maybe he couldn't hold his liquor and it led to some disastrous ends. But one of the things that I think you spoke to was that they both feared different things of the system. There's the fear of the dictator from above and the fear of the mob from below. And they're kind of two sides to the same coin. Can you dig into that a little bit more? Explain how they in some ways feared the same result, but from different directions.
Absolutely. And it goes back to their basic disagreement about rule by elites or democracy. I mean, Hamilton might have called it aristocracy in the sense of, should we have rule by the landed property classes, or should the people always rule? And Hamilton fears rule by the people and prefers rule by elites. One of the last letters he writes days before the duel is, "The greatest threat we face is democracy." And he's determined to tame the mob and to ensure that reason rather than passion prevails by empowering a strong president and a strong Senate, which he also wants elected for life. And he's not out on his own here. Gouverneur Morris, his ally, has the exact same proposal at favoring a life Senate and at times supporting the idea of a lifetime president. So this was basically the Federalist position, that the people, the mob, cannot be trusted, and the property classes have to be empowered to make wise decisions in their stead. Jefferson's the opposite. The central premise of his political philosophy is that the will of the majority must always prevail. He tends to exalt local democracy. His vision of utopia is the Edenic, the shires of ancient Wales or of rural Virginia. And he wants to divide political units into the townships or shires. And he thinks that in the Saxon woads, self-governing groups were able to cast votes through direct democracy on a small scale. It's a very romantic vision, which becomes increasingly implausible as a model for life in industrial America. But that's the basic division between Hamilton and Jefferson on democracy versus rule by elites.
Experience leadership like never before at the George Washington Leadership Institute. Inspired by the timeless lessons of George Washington, our programs focus on critical skills like effective communication, emotional intelligence, adaptability, strategic vision, and character-driven leadership. Immerse your team in a journey through history while equipping them with strategies to navigate today's complex challenges. Join us at the beautiful George Washington Presidential Library at Mount Vernon for a half-day or full-day sessions, or customize a program to fit your needs. Visit gwleadershipinstitute.org to learn more.
On this podcast, I often ask what sort of history people learned from, what books they read, were they aware of history? But there's an inverse of that phenomenon that you describe in the book, which I think is fascinating, which is the impact of books and culture on the legacy of Hamilton and Jefferson. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
It's just heartening to see how transformative books can be on culture. And it's the publication, first of all, of Hamilton and Jefferson's papers that transforms their reputation in their own lifetimes. It's Jefferson's papers being published in the 1820s, I think, that really gives him a boost on life. John Quincy Adams reads them, and that leads to his preeminence during the period. The publication of Hamilton's papers right before the Civil War in the 1850s, I think. And James Garfield reads right before the war as well and uses them to lead a Hamilton revival. And then think of all the really important books that fanned the Hamilton revival in the Progressive era, in particular, a fictionalized biography of Hamilton written by Gertrude Atherton, The Conqueror, being a romantic and true story of Hamilton. He goes viral with this international bestseller, and everyone's a Hamiltonian. And we've talked about some of the 20th century books, including the Claude Bowers Jefferson versus Hamilton, and obviously Chernow, and the musical. It's a tribute to a reading culture, and it's also really striking that many of the presidents who presided over these transformations of culture were themselves such deep readers. And for me, this book is a love letter to the thrill and excitement and relevance of reading and writing history. And when you think of, I won't run through the whole list now unless you think it's fun to do it together, but presidents from John Quincy Adams and Martin Van Buren, who wrote political histories of the United States, tracing it back to Hamilton and Jefferson, to Theodore Roosevelt, who wrote a biography of Gouverneur Morris, to William Jefferson Clinton, who exalted his namesake and had deep reflections on his legacy. Our presidents have been deeper readers of history than I had imagined.
It's so important because, there's that cliche phrase, if you don't know history, then you're doomed to repeat it. But I think it's in some elements quite true. And I think especially for leaders and presidential leaders that this job is impossible. And if you haven't studied some of the things that come before you, you are doomed to make mistakes that are easily avoidable. There are things you can do. You're never going to have a perfect presidency, of course. You're always going to make mistakes, but you can avoid some very easy traps by knowing what has come before your time in office.
So true, but I just came across a letter from Madison to his college friend, William Bradford, and he was talking about the urgent importance of studying history and why he had chosen to do it. And it's certainly, absolutely learning from its errors to avoid repeating them. And I think it's also a sense of the ebb and flow of history, the inexorable cycles. Polybius thought that the move from monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy to tyranny, oligarchy, and the mob was inexorable, that history always repeated itself. And even if we couldn't avoid its errors, we can understand our present moment more if we see that the challenges we're going through are not all based on individuals or chance or fortune or providence, although that always plays a central role in history, but also in structural principles that no republic has been able to escape.
It's so true. When I talk about the 1790s, we'll often describe a decade that is characterized by very intense partisanship, weak parties, debates over xenophobia and citizenship and freedom of speech and foreign interference in elections and all of these things that sound so familiar to us today. And we should specify that we don't actually think that history repeats itself because every moment is in some ways unique, but it does rhyme, which is, I think, a phrase that Mark Twain coined. And that is in some ways extremely comforting because while it does not offer perfect solutions, it does remind us that these things can be cyclical and there are things we can learn from that cyclical nature.
Absolutely. It was so striking for me to see, first of all, how serious the partisanship and, in fact, the violence in American history was, how open subversion of federal authority and resistance to it had been so pervasive, and also how pervasive political opportunism had been with presidents and justices switching from Hamilton and Jefferson in order to achieve their preferred results. Suddenly our own era doesn't seem uniquely unprincipled or uniquely violent. Those were pervasive throughout American history. But at the same time, it provides grounds for hope. It's so inspiring throughout history to see how these ideals have provided aspirations and beacons for people to try to live up to, even as they've necessarily failed in practice. And in that sense, they are the ideals that bind us throughout American history.
They are. Before we move to our last two traditional questions, I want to ask you about two additional projects. The first is, I alluded to a trilogy, so the concept of union. What will you be exploring for this third book in union, and why is it important that we know about it today?
We haven't quite come up with a subtitle, but it's something about how James Madison and three forgotten founders defined the Constitutional Convention and saved America. Of course, telling these stories through personalities is important. So the question was, and it's a wonderful parlor game for listeners. Of course, at the Constitutional Convention, Madison is essential, but who else to write about? And I debated and went back and forth and talked to my great colleagues at the National Constitution Center, and then finally just found a list of who spoke most frequently at the convention. It always takes a while to figure out the bleedingly obvious. And we have on this list, number one, James Wilson spoke most frequently, and then Gouverneur Morris, and then Madison, and then Roger Sherman. And as it turns out, each of those, in addition to having unbelievably compelling, dramatic, tragic, raunchy stories that are really fun to tell, you can tell the whole story of the convention through their conduct, along with that of the South Carolina delegation led by John Rutledge, which was responsible for all the most nefarious compromises over slavery. So it's going to be a book that tells their stories, that asks what they thought the purpose of union was, and how they attempted to advance that at the Constitutional Convention, and what it can teach us about the importance of union today.
Fantastic. And the second is a project that is out now, and that is a civics toolkit for the 250th anniversary of the United States, which I had the privilege to contribute to. Could you tell us what it is and where people can find it?
We're so honored to have your contribution, and so exciting that the Civic Toolkit will be published as a paperback by Simon & Schuster in May with your contribution, and that is great American historians who we invited to talk about the big ideas of the Declaration and the Constitution. And in addition to your great essay, we have Danielle Allen on equality, Robbie George on liberty, Gordon Wood on government by consent. Akhil Amar has annotated the whole Declaration clause by clause. There are biographies of the founders by Carol Birkin. Walter Isaacson will be contributing an excerpt from his book on the Declaration. And it's just a constitutional and historical feast. It's so exciting to put this great toolkit out into the world. It's online now, so listeners should check it out at the Constitution Center's website for the Civic Toolkit for America 250 and learn from it and start book clubs around it and have intergenerational conversations with kids and grandparents about the principles of the American Constitution and Declaration. We're also touring it to a series of rural bookstores and libraries. I was just out last week in Tunston, California at the Avita & Co. bookstore in this town of 80,000 in Orange County. The mayor introduced the discussion, and a high school student came with her favorite teacher to lead the questions, and the city council showed up. It's just so inspiring to go to bookstores, which are third spaces in America today that allow us to transcend partisan politics and talk about the big principles of the American idea. And that's what we're going to do throughout America 250 with this great toolkit.
That's amazing. There are also phenomenal video accompaniment to that, which I was so blown away by. So people should definitely check that out. Okay, so our last two questions. The penultimate one is, what is one book that taught you something about leadership?
It would have to be Chernow's Washington, which is a great biography of Washington. And Washington's, for me, the best model of leadership. And he embodies leadership. And his performance at Newburgh, where he appeals for virtue and expresses humility, is a model of leadership, which, after all, involves, centrally as Washington chose us, setting aside your own ego and tending to the common good and inspiring your soldiers or your fellow citizens to set aside their own ego and their interests of faction and to tend to the common good. And that's the great challenge of America, and Washington embodied it better than anyone.
Well, you just merged our last two questions so beautifully, because the last one is, what do you think of when you think of Washington and leadership? And I admire your foresight to be able to combine both of those into one answer. So that was perfect. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us. This was such a pleasure to be able to talk with you again. And we will look forward to talking to you again whenever your union book is ready.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, for another wonderful conversation. And thanks for our great collaboration for America 250.
Thank you for joining us this week on Leadership and Legacy. And thank you so much again to our guest, Jeffrey Rosen. You can find his most recent book, The Pursuit of Liberty: How Hamilton versus Jefferson Ignited the Lasting Battle Over Power in America, wherever you like to buy books, including our own bookstore here at Mount Vernon. And you can check out the many wonderful resources created by the Constitution Center to mark America's 250th birthday on their website, constitutioncenter.org. I'm your host, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. Leadership and Legacy, Conversations at the George Washington Presidential Library is a production of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association and Primary Source Media. In the spirit of George Washington's leadership, we feature the perspectives of leaders from across industries and fields. As such, the thoughts expressed in this podcast are solely the views of our guests and do not reflect the opinions of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. To learn more about Washington's leadership example, or to find out how you can bring your team to the George Washington Presidential Library, visit gwleadershipinstitute.org. Or to find more great podcasts from Mount Vernon, visit georgewashingtonpodcast.com. You can also explore the work of Primary Source Media at primarysourcemedia.com. Join us in 2 weeks for our next great conversation.